Step away from the counter. Now. Officer, is there a problem? That car outside doesn't match you. I'm waiting for my coffee. Keep talking and I'll add interference.
On a Saturday morning in October, in one of the most affluent zip codes in the Commonwealth of Virginia, a man stood in line at a bakery waiting for a baguette. He was wearing a faded Oxford sweatshirt, gray joggers, and a pair of worn-in sneakers. He had his wallet in his left pocket and a small navy blue passport in the right one. He was not causing a scene. He was not raising his voice. He was watching the baker slide a tray of sourdough loaves out of the oven and thinking about whether he wanted coffee with his order. In any other version of that morning, that man would have walked out 10 minutes later with a paper bag and gone back to his house 4 blocks away. But a neighbor had made a phone call, and that phone call sent Officer Grant Whitaker through the front door of the Golden Grain Artisanal Bakery and into what would become one of the most catastrophic legal implosions in the history of the Arlington County Police Department. What Officer Whitaker did not know was that in the next 11 minutes, his routine response to a suspicious person call would transform into a federal incident that would reach the floors of the United Nations, the desks of the U.S. State Department, and the front pages of newspapers in 17 countries. The man in the sweatshirt was Ambassador Kofi Mensah, and Kofi Mensah was untouchable. Not in the colloquial sense, not in the way powerful men sometimes believe themselves to be above consequence. Literally, legally, and by the binding force of international treaty, no local law enforcement officer in the United States of America had the authority to lay a single finger on him. That protection was not a courtesy, not a professional agreement between agencies, and not something that could be waived by a patrol officer who believed he was cleaning up the streets. It was codified in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, ratified in 1961, signed by the United States, and carrying the full weight of federal law. Article 29 of that convention is unambiguous. A diplomatic agent shall not be liable to any form of arrest or detention. The person of a diplomatic agent shall be inviolable. Inviolable. That is not a word with room for interpretation. Kofi Mensah was born in Accra, Ghana, into a family that treated education the way other families treat inheritance, as the most valuable thing one generation could hand to the next. His father, Emmanuel Mensah, was a civil engineer who spent 30 years designing water infrastructure in rural communities across West Africa. His mother, Abina, was a secondary school mathematics teacher who reportedly graded papers by candlelight when the electricity failed, which in Accra during the 1980s was more often than not. They were not a wealthy family by global standards, but they were relentless in the particular way that parents become relentless when they understand that their child has something rare. Kofi was that child. By the time he was 16, he had won a national academic scholarship and was corresponding in 3 languages. He was admitted to Oxford University on a full merit scholarship where he studied international relations and graduated with first-class honors. He did not stop there. He crossed the Atlantic and enrolled at Yale Law School, focusing on international humanitarian law and conflict resolution. He graduated in the top 4% of his class. He then turned down 3 private sector offers that would have made him wealthy by any measure, and instead accepted a position as a junior advisor with the United Nations. That was 30 years ago. In the 3 decades that followed, Kofi Mensah had sat across negotiating tables from warlords, heads of state, and regional militias in some of the most volatile corners of the world. South Sudan, the Eastern Congo, the Tigray region of Ethiopia. He had helped broker ceasefires that did not make headlines because, when they work, ceasefires don't make headlines. He had lost colleagues to violence in the field. He had missed his daughter's first steps because he was in a satellite office in Juba trying to keep a fragile peace agreement from collapsing overnight. He carried that kind of weight quietly, the way people do when they have decided their work matters more than their comfort. By the time he settled into his home in Arlington, Virginia, Kofi Mensah was a senior advisor on international security for the United Nations and held the rank of ambassador. His blue UN diplomatic passport, the document that identifies the holder as a protected foreign official under both international law and the direct jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of State, was as legitimate as any document that exists in the legal architecture of modern civilization. He had carried that passport into conflict zones. He had presented it at border crossings in countries where rule of law was little more than a rumor. He had never once had it questioned. On the morning of October 14th, inside a flour-dusted bakery that smelled like coffee and warm bread, Officer Grant Whitaker knocked it out of his hand and called it a cheap fake. Whitaker had been with the Arlington County Police for 6 years. In that time, he had accumulated a record that, in retrospect, reads less like a personnel file and more like a forecasted outcome. Internal documents later obtained through court discovery revealed that Whitaker had been the subject of 4 separate complaints related to pretextual stops, traffic, and pedestrian interventions that are technically lawful on their surface, but are used in practice to target individuals based on race or perceived class rather than any specific criminal behavior. 3 of those complaints came from black men in affluent Arlington neighborhoods. 2 were flagged by supervisors. None resulted in formal disciplinary action. Whitaker's arrest statistics were strong, which in many departments is enough to keep a file clean, regardless of how those numbers were generated. On that Saturday, Whitaker was responding to a call logged as a suspicious person complaint. The caller, a neighbor who lived 2 streets over from Mensah's home, had described seeing a black man she did not recognize walking through the neighborhood and entering the bakery. That was the entirety of the description. There was no mention of threatening behavior, no alleged crime, no physical altercation, no stolen property. A man she did not recognize had walked into a bakery. That was the threshold that sent a uniformed officer with a loaded weapon through the door of a civilian business. When Whitaker entered the Golden Grain, the bakery was occupied by at least 14 other customers, families with children, elderly couples, a pair of women sharing a table near the window. Whitaker walked past all of them. He moved directly to the back of the line where Kofi Mensah was standing and informed him that he fit the description of a local shoplifter who had been active in the area. Witnesses later recalled that the announcement was loud enough that everyone in the bakery turned to look. Mensah was calm. People who knew him well would later say that was consistent with who he was, a man trained by decades of high-stakes negotiation to maintain composure in adversarial environments. He told Whitaker clearly, without raising his voice, that he was a resident of the neighborhood, that he was simply waiting to make a purchase, and that he had not committed any offense. When Whitaker asked him to step outside for a pat-down, Mensah declined. He then reached into his right pocket, produced the blue UN diplomatic passport, held it out, and said the words that should have ended the encounter immediately. "Officer, I am a protected diplomat under the State Department. You do not have the authority to search me." What happened next was captured in full on Whitaker's own body camera. Whitaker looked at the passport for approximately 2 seconds. He then slapped it out of Mensah's hand. The passport hit the tile floor and slid under a display case near the register. Whitaker said, and these are his exact words as transcribed from the body camera audio, "I don't care about your get-out-of-jail-free card. In this town, I'm the only authority that matters." He then told Mensah he was being detained for obstruction of justice, ordered him to face the counter, and handcuffed him in front of every person in that bakery. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires that any search or seizure be supported by probable cause. Whitaker had none. A vague, anonymous complaint that a man had entered a bakery does not constitute probable cause. The claim that someone fits the description of a shoplifter, a description that, in the official complaint log, contained no identifying characteristics beyond race, does not constitute probable cause. Legal precedent on this is not subtle. In Terry v. Ohio, the Supreme Court held that even a brief investigatory stop requires specific, articulable facts giving rise to reasonable suspicion. Whitaker had no such facts. What he had was a phone call from a neighbor who found a black man's presence in her neighborhood unusual. Beyond the Fourth Amendment, Whitaker had now committed something far more serious than a departmental policy violation. Under 18 U.S.C. paragraph 112, it is a federal crime to assault, strike, or physically harm a foreign official or official guest of the United States. Knocking a diplomatic credential out of the hand of a protected diplomat and placing that diplomat in handcuffs without legal authority does not live in a gray area under that statute. It is a federal criminal offense. And beyond domestic law, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which the United States helped draft and has been a signatory to for over 60 years, had been violated in a bakery in Arlington, Virginia, in front of a dozen witnesses and on camera. There is a term used in diplomatic and legal circles for what Whitaker did. It is called a catastrophic breach, not because the word catastrophic is rhetorical emphasis, but because the consequences cascade outward in ways that local law enforcement is simply not equipped to manage. Mensah was taken to a holding area at the Arlington County Police Station. He did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He asked once to make a phone call. Within 40 minutes of that phone call, the situation had moved entirely beyond Arlington County's ability to contain. Mensah's office had immediately contacted the United Nations Secretariat in New York. The Secretariat contacted the Office of Protocol at the U.S. Department of State. The State Department contacted the Arlington County Police Department. The conversation that followed between a State Department senior official and the Arlington County Police Chief has been been described by people familiar with the exchange as the kind of conversation that ends careers before anyone hangs up the phone. Mensah was released within the hour. The body cam footage had already been reviewed. The blue passport retrieved from under the display case at the Golden Grain was authenticated in minutes by the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions. There was no ambiguity about what had happened, who was responsible, and what it meant. The Ghanaian embassy filed a formal diplomatic protest with the U.S. Department of State the same afternoon. By Sunday morning, the Ghanaian foreign minister had issued a public statement. By Monday, the story had been picked up by international wire services and was being reported in London, Accra, Brussels, and Nairobi. The United Nations formally requested a full accounting of the incident from the U.S. mission in New York. Congressional offices began receiving calls from State Department liaisons. The word tribunal started appearing in internal communications. The United States government was now in a position that no administration wants to be in, defending the conduct of a local patrol officer against the full diplomatic machinery of the international community on camera with audio. If this story is reaching you right now, it is because too many incidents like this one get buried in local filing systems and never make it to the people who need to hear them. The moment you share this, someone else learns that diplomatic immunity is real, that the law has teeth, and that accountability is possible, even when it takes a crisis of international proportions to force it into the open. Arlington County's legal exposure was extraordinary. The city faced potential civil liability under multiple federal statutes, the prospect of an international tribunal that would have placed American diplomatic credibility on trial, and the political fallout of a case that had become a live international incident before the workweek had begun. The negotiations between the city's legal team, the State Department, and Ambassador Mensah's legal representation moved quickly. The settlement reached was $6 million, paid by the city of Arlington. Mensah's legal team had been explicit that the figure was not punitive in the traditional sense. It was the number the city agreed to in exchange for a resolution that would not require airing the full scope of the department's internal records in open court. Those records, as discovery had already begun to reveal, showed a pattern of pretextual stops that would have been deeply damaging to the department's credibility in any public proceeding. Officer Grant Whitaker was terminated immediately following a departmental review that lasted less than 48 hours. The review board's language was notable: gross negligence, willful disregard of federal protocol, and conduct unbecoming of a law enforcement officer. His badge was surrendered. He was permanently decertified as a law enforcement officer in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which means no department in the state can ever hire him in a law enforcement capacity again. He was placed on the National Decertification Database, making it effectively impossible for him to serve in any police capacity in the United States. The Department of Justice did not stop there. A federal grand jury indicted Whitaker under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 112 for the physical mistreatment of a foreign official. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the body camera footage, the State Department authentication of Mensah's credentials, and the testimonies of 11 witnesses who had been present in the bakery. Whitaker's defense argued that he had no way of verifying the authenticity of the document in the field, that he had acted in good faith on a suspicious person complaint, and that the physical contact did not rise to the threshold of assault under federal statute. The jury was not persuaded. Whitaker was convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early release for the first 3 years under the sentencing guidelines applicable to federal offenses against foreign officials. He reported to FCI Cumberland in Maryland in January of the following year. The legacy of what happened inside that bakery did not stop with a settlement check and a prison sentence. The incident had exposed something that had existed as a quiet institutional failure for years. Local law enforcement agencies across the D.C. metropolitan area had no standardized training for identifying or responding to diplomatic credentials. Officers were expected to exercise discretion in situations that required not discretion, but legal knowledge that the training academies had not provided. The State Department, in coordination with the Arlington County government and under pressure from a bipartisan congressional caucus, established what became formally known as the Mensah Protocol. The protocol created 3 binding structural reforms. The first was the Blue Shield Identification Law. Every patrol officer in the greater DC metropolitan area is now required to complete a mandatory training module on the recognition, verification, and legal handling of diplomatic credentials. The training is not optional and is a condition of continued certification. It is reviewed and updated annually by the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions. Officers who fail to complete it are suspended until they do. The second was the State Department verification portal. Every squad car in Arlington County, and following a regional mandate in the surrounding jurisdictions, has a direct digital interface with a 24-hour State Department verification hotline. Before any officer initiates a search, detention, or physical contact with any individual who claims diplomatic immunity, the officer is required to run a real-time verification through that portal. The verification takes under 3 minutes. The result is logged automatically to the officer's body camera system. There is now no legal pathway for an officer to claim ignorance of a credential's validity in the field. The third was the creation of the Diplomatic Liaison Office of Arlington County, a permanent municipal office staffed by personnel trained in international protocol and reporting directly to the State Department. Its function is to serve as a real-time bridge between street-level law enforcement and the federal diplomatic infrastructure. Any contact between an Arlington officer and an individual claiming foreign official status triggers a mandatory notification to that office. The office's director holds veto authority over any law enforcement action involving a credentialed diplomat until the State Department has been consulted. These were not recommendations, they were enforceable requirements written into county ordinance and tied to federal funding compliance. Departments that failed to implement them within the mandated timeline faced suspension of federal law enforcement grants. Kofi Mensah returned to his work at the United Nations. He gave no press conferences and declined all interview requests. His office released a single statement, 3 sentences long, which read in its entirety, "The events of October 14th were distressing. The response of the United States government, once properly engaged, was appropriate. Ambassador Mensah remains committed to his work and to the principles of international law that make that work possible." The restraint of that statement is its own kind of document. It says something about the man who wrote it or who approved it, that he chose those 3 sentences when he could have chosen to burn the whole situation to the ground publicly and been entirely justified in doing so. He had the platform, he had the moral authority, he had the footage, he had a $6 million settlement and a federal conviction as supporting evidence for everything he might have said. He said 3 sentences and went back to work. What Officer Grant Whitaker had on that Saturday morning was a theory that a black man in a faded sweatshirt standing in line at a bakery in a neighborhood where that man had lived for years was suspicious enough to override due process, ignore a federal legal document, and place a decorated United Nations ambassador in handcuffs on the floor of a business in front of children. That theory cost the city of Arlington $6 million. It cost Whitaker his career, his certification, and 5 years of his life in a federal correctional facility. It cost the United States government a diplomatic incident that required weeks of international damage control to resolve. And it cost the Arlington County Police Department whatever remaining credibility it had with the communities it was supposed to serve. The bakery, for what it is worth, still operates at the same address. The flour-dusted counter where Ambassador Mensah was forced to stand is still there. The tiles where his blue diplomatic passport slid across the floor are still there. The people in the neighborhood still walk past it on Saturday mornings on their way in for coffee and sourdough. The only thing that changed is that now, somewhere in every squad car in the jurisdiction, there is a portal connected to the State Department that an officer is required to use before making the kind of mistake that Grant Whitaker made. The law had always been there. The treaty had always been signed. The passport had always been real. The only thing missing on that October morning was an officer willing to look before he acted. And now, because of what happened when he didn't, an entire system has been rebuilt around the assumption that looking is not optional.